Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with author Travis Atria of the 2020 book Better Days Will Come Again, The Life of Arthur Briggs, Jazz Genius of Harlem, Paris, and a Nazi prison camp. He opened up about this important book in relation to jazz history, social justice, and political importance. He hustled to Paris to find Arthur's daughter after catching wind of him in a book. The journey and story of how he captured this man is intriguing. There were a number of grand revelations and tales to tell along the way, so please get to know Travis and this book and dig this interview, my friends.
First of all, I just want to thank you for taking a minute to talk with me on Jazz today.
Oh, no, thank you. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, if you have a pulse and you like jazz and you want a good story, I can't imagine anybody would look at this book for more than 20 seconds and not be allured to come in and give it a read because it's a great book.
Oh, thank you.
You bet. And then I guess now in this current American fall that we're under, things that are happening, there's probably no better time for us, not only because things are slowed down, but because of the gravity of our situation as human beings right now. I guess it's probably a little bit more applicable for us to be talking about something pretty grave that like Arthur went through and what we're living through right now. So
he was on tour during the Spanish flu of 1918,
Yeah, and it was interesting, too, because, I just around the time I was reading this, I had gone to a Titanic exhibit, and there was that chapter about how he survived that ordeal on the boat and just everything that he had to go through. So it's an enormously rich story, and what I want to do is just start at the top and ask you, how did the birth of this idea come about, and kind of how did it gain steam and get to where it was actually a printed book?
Sure. So I came across Author Briggs by accident. I was in a bookstore in 2010, and I bought a book because I liked the way the cover looked. It was about Americans who stayed in Paris after the Nazi occupation. And in this book, there was maybe 3 sentences about Arthur Briggs, jazz trumpeter known as the Louis Armstrong of France, captured by the Nazis, played in a classical orchestra in a Nazi prison camp. And that was it. To me, that was the most interesting part of the book. I thought, how is it possible there's not more information about this guy? At that point, I was working on another book, biography of a great American musician named Curtis Mayfield. But I kept this Arthur Briggs guy in the back of my head. And so when I finished the Curtis Mayfield book, I said, you know what, I think that Arthur Briggs this is a story that I really want to know more about, first of all, just to see, is there something enough for a book there? And honestly, to me, it seemed like it was more than a book. It seemed like it just seemed cinematic. It seemed like it could be a movie. So I started looking into his life. I started just kind of researching him, going to the public library in New York. I lived in New York at the time, and, just kind of finding any mention of him in any American newspapers, which actually African-American newspapers followed him, his kind of exploits in Europe. I was able to pretty much pinpoint all of his movements, and the more I learned about the guy, the more I thought, okay, this is a huge story. It's an epic, and it never ceased to amaze me how his life seemed to intersect with just every single person and every single event of importance, really between World War I and World War II. Talked to my agent about it. He thought it was a good idea, so I wrote a book proposal. At that point, I was able to research, just by research, I was able to get enough information to write an okay book. But I wasn't able to find anyone that knew him. So I wasn't really, and he only gave a couple interviews in his life, so I wasn't really able to, to kind of have him as a character. I could tell you very detailed stuff about everything he did and about the people he knew, but I couldn't really say anything about what he thought or what he felt. And I knew in order to do that, I was going to have to find somebody that knew him. I learned that he had a daughter, and she lived in Paris at one point. I didn't know if she was still alive or if she still lived in Paris, and I tried everything I could think of to find her. I couldn't do it, so I went to Paris hoping to find her, and I figured if I didn't find her, I could at least do some research there. And while I was there, I met a couple French jazz historians who kind of put me in touch with a guy who put me in touch with a guy who used to live next door to Arthur Briggs and his daughter. and he knew that she still lived in this apartment, so he gave me her address. And I wrote her a letter explaining who I was and what I wanted to do, and I delivered it to her apartment. I didn't meet her. I just was able to kind of put the letter in the door type of thing. And about 6 months later, she contacted me. She had a cousin in New York, James Briggs Murray, who she asked this guy to check me out, basically, to see, if I was legit, who I was. And he is a great man. He used to do, I think he curated some jazz collection for the Schomburg Center, and he's been a radio personality, and just, he's got a deep knowledge of jazz. And so he read my Curtis book, and as he likes to tell me, that was the music of his era, and he said if you made one mistake, I was going to catch it. But he said he really liked the way I did the Curtis book, and so he told his Arthur Briggs' daughter, that she should work with me. And so she had been approached many times since her father's death and had never agreed to speak to a writer before. But she invited me to Paris to meet with her. While I was there, she told me that her father, before he died, had recorded essentially his oral memoir. He told his entire life story on a bunch of cassette tapes, which she had, and she gave me access to them. And so finally, I was able to put center into the picture. Kind of not only talk about what he did, but who he was and what it meant to him. Is that an okay answer to the question?
Man,
I'm rambling on.
No, that's wonderful, and that's great. I love that. I love that notion where people do actually leave their audio behind, because he would have to know that his story is rich. So my question to you is this. You seem like the type that really wants to keep this, biography tradition, these stories of these musicians alive and going. Why do you think that is? I mean, I'm in the same boat, but why do you think it's so important with jazz and the state of where we're at, our world in 2020 with music?
Well, I'm a musician, first and foremost, and I think that I gravitate naturally towards musician stories. I think it's important for me to talk about, I should say, I'm always been fascinated with where music meets social awareness. So, a guy like Curtis Mayfield was, I think, the premier songwriter of the civil rights movement. And I thought I saw a lot of social importance in Arthur Briggs' story. I think down to the fact that while I was in Paris meeting his daughter, the day after I had gone to the location where he was held in a Nazi prison camp, it was literally the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. I watched that on French TV, the news broadcast of that, and I was scared to come home. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't know what country I was coming home to. And so I think that to me, the more I learned about Arthur Briggs' life, the more I realized that there was something vital. The message of his life was vital to these times we're living in, because we seem to have forgotten that Nazis are bad for some reason for a couple of years there. And not only that, but I think the power of the love that he had for music is what saved his life. So for me, it was just, it was such a nice dovetailing of the things that I'm interested in. I think, like I say somewhere in the book, 100 years ago is not that long. I mean, it seems like forever for us, but it is not that long, and we forget these things, both the music and I think the lessons of the things he went through at our own peril. I'd say there's an important message in all of it, I think, for us to remember today.
Absolutely, I agree, and I think the irony of all of this, of Arthur's life, is that, and I think about this because last week Dexter Gordon's wife, Maxine, was in Kansas City. It was the day before the real lockdown happened.
Okay.
I heard her speak, and she was talking about how Dexter was one of those musicians that went to Europe. And the irony of this is that he was avoiding America to a certain degree to get into a place that was more accepting, and he ended up getting trapped into something that was way, way bigger than anything, racism or anything that was being had here, no matter how bad it was. You know what I'm saying? So that's an interesting tapestry.
Right, and that's what happened to Arthur Briggs, too. I mean, he could have come back to America. He had family in Harlem. He was warned to leave Paris. He had made a name for himself. The African American newspapers of the time were writing that they were the ones that called him the Louis Armstrong of France. I think it was the Chicago Defender that called him that. He could have had a career here, but he was not American. He came from the island of Grenada, but he did live in Harlem as a teenager, and he also toured America in the 30s, right, kind of in the depths of the Great Depression, and he hated it. He hated segregation so much. It just abused his sense of dignity so much that he said, I'm staying in Paris, and that was led him to be captured by the Nazis. I mean, it's really, I think it's heartbreaking in a way. He was between a rock and a hard place, literally. He had nowhere to turn where he was not going to be menaced and threatened no matter what he did, because of his skin. Literally just because of the color of his skin.
My father passed in '08, and we found some tapes and had no idea that he had left his life story behind on tape.
Oh,
and
cool.
It was wild, and I remember in that journey there was a lot of things that I remember hearing on those tapes that I never knew about him. So my question to you is this: you did get that gift of having himself put his story down. So what was surprising about what you heard that you just didn't expect, or that was kind of revelatory?
That's a great question. Well, I think one thing for me was I got a better sense of him as a man and what all these things meant to him. I think one thing I did not expect was really the ways that he grew, I think, through his life. Because, he as you're listening to these tapes in the beginning, he's a very impulsive man in his youth. And he was so obsessed with his own dignity, and anyone that slighted him, he would be gone. He would leave the bandstand if he had to. He did not give people even a second chance. And then as he kind of grew, he was much more, like if somebody apologized to him, after they insulted him, they become best friends. It was like he was a very round character. He wasn't just one thing or another, and he was also, I think, a very decent man. Usually, when you hear about a person where there's not really much bad to say about them, it doesn't seem real. But from every account, and everyone that knew him, even from his own family's account, and from listening to him speak on these things, it was just like he just seemed to be a truly good and decent person, which I think, it makes the story even more powerful, because you've got this guy that is just a kind soul in the middle of the most evil regime of the 20th century, and also he's in a business where I think the fact that he was so magnanimous and so generous and so he didn't like to boast, I think that hurt him as a musician. I think that's part of the reason he did not become as well known as some of his contemporaries, because he was always obsessed with the music as a whole, and what he called the brotherhood of musicians. And this hurt him many times, because there's people that were more cutthroat than he was. There's people that would kind of either take his accomplishments as their own or ignore his accomplishments. And I think that really did hurt him.
The one thing that I find interesting about Arthur and Armstrong and a lot of those cats from that time is you hear about these stories that are really about overcoming a lot of things, whether it's poverty, racism, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But the music always sounds so hopeful. I mean, I've been listening to Arthur's music more lately, and it's like all of the music. What do you think it was about those guys that even though, jazz was protest music and there was levels of it that was they're trying to get a foothold on things, what was it about their voices that were so buoyant and positive and optimistic?
I think, it's my take, and I'm saying this as a white man who, grew up in the 80s, so I'm definitely not an expert on this, but my feeling is that and this is something that I think I have a couple quotes from Sidney Bechet, the great jazz clarinet player, who he basically says the exact same thing. It's that the music was essentially, in some cases, all they had. Like, you have a people that had been pushed to the margins, that had been menaced, murdered, and enslaved, and Jim Crowed, and all these different things. And I think that the sound that you hear that comes out of that, it is the sound of the human spirit, the sound of the human spirit that refuses to die. I think it's joyful because it has to be, because in a way it's like, in a way it's a finger in the eye of everything that is trying to, that is not joyful about this situation. It is, I think it is, and I think that's why so many people respond to it, because it is coming from it is almost straight from the soul, straight from the human, the depths of the human spirit. I think that's why it's so powerful.
So, why is this book in the annals of not only jazz, but probably what we're going through in our world today, which I'm always shocked that we've reverted back to levels on a global and even a national basis of things that are racist and that are that just aren't right. So why is this book, do you believe, so important for jazz fans and for people that are a fan of a good story? Why is this book important?
I think for jazz fans especially, it's important because this is an untold story of a pretty huge figure that has been forgotten, and it also gives you an angle on a lot of other legends like Sidney Bechet, who Arthur Briggs was essentially his babysitter in the Southern Syncopated Orchestra, or Louis Armstrong, or Django Reinhardt. Arthur Briggs helped Django Reinhardt get his career off the ground. So you get a lot of cool, it's almost like a behind the scenes, because Arthur Briggs is not such a known name, but you get this new perspective on a lot of things that you might have thought you already knew, but here's a new perspective. And I think for just the general audience, as you say, it's no secret that kind of far-right governments are on the rise around the world, that authoritarianism is on the rise again, and I think, we're in a generation where the people growing up today, they might not have the chance to even know anyone that survived the Holocaust. The World War II generation is pretty much gone, or is almost gone. And it's easy, I think, to not pay attention, to not pay attention to that history. It is easy to forget what it looks like when these things start happening and where they lead. I think it is terribly dangerous. My hope is that, this book will be a reminder that, first of all, these sorts of things are always with us. It's not just because, we won World War II, it's all over now. I think sometimes we like to tie things up in a nice bow, like they defeated Hitler, don't have to worry about that anymore. But it's the spirit, it's what he represented, is always with us. It's probably the dark part of the human experience and just humanity in general. And I think it's terribly important now to remember, now that we're in an early stage of it, that things like refugee crises, which climate change is expected to cause, things like economic collapse, which happened to Germany after World War I, and was a huge part of the reason that the Nazis became so popular, and we're kind of seeing a little bit right now with the stock market decline and the coronavirus. Any sort of societal unrest, civil unrest, when people are afraid, they tend to look to a leader that claims strength, that says, I have the answers. Maybe it's human nature, but it can lead to the worst things imaginable. It is never too soon, I think, to start fighting back against these things. And I hope that this book is a reminder of, how present these things still are, and how, in terms of history, how recent it really was, how much it still affects our world, and how hard we worked to defeat it the first time should be a lesson to us on how hard we should work to make sure we don't even have to fight it the second time.
Absolutely. It does. It totally does. And I think probably now, in this American time that we're in, with people having more downtime, this would be a great opportunity to read a book like this on so many levels to kind of, rekindle some notions inside of us about overcoming and just history. We are bound to recreate it if we don't adhere to the lessons of it. So
I believe that, and I think that part of Arthur Briggs, to me, the beauty of Arthur Briggs' life is that, again, it's about, it might sound really hippy dippy, but it's about love ultimately. It's about his love, and it's not romantic love. It is that kind of spiritual love, that the kind of love that ignites the fire inside of you. That's the love he had for music, and it propelled him around the entire world. It made him famous. It made him rich, but it also saved his life in a Nazi prison camp, and also gave hope to 2,000 other men who are suffering around him.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that to me, that is the thing. I think we need to find that love within yourself. And it doesn't have to be about music. Whatever it is for, find that within yourself, that is the place to act from. That made him more powerful in a way than the Nazis.
Absolutely. Well, hey, man, thank you for reaching out. Thank you for taking some time to talk about the book. I hope people go out and grab it, whether it's during this time of, what we're going through with more downtime or after the fact. And I appreciate you adding to the annals of jazz story. It's always a pleasure to read it.
Thank you so much. Nice talking to you, too.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest authors and players in Europe, Harlem, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Travis for his time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.